So let me pull up my notes and let's get started. Hello, writers. Welcome. Jacob Jans here with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Emily Harstone. She'll be giving a talk on how to regularly publish your writing in literary journals, one of the best ways that you can build a long-term writing career. This is part of our monthly lecture series where we present talks on the craft of writing and the business of publishing. Emily Harstone is one of the founding editors of Authors Publish magazine, as well as the author of many popular books for writers, including Submit, Publish, Repeat, the Authors Publish Guide to Manuscript Submissions, as well as our annual guide to manuscript publishers. Emily also has extensive experience publishing her own writing in literary journals. She's been published in over a dozen countries and 4 continents. As an instructor for the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish, her courses always sell out very quickly. Also, I'm pleased to announce that the next edition of Submit, Publish, Repeat is just about available, and everyone here will be getting a free copy of the ebook within the next week or so, so keep an eye out for that as well. So without further ado, I'm very grateful to Emily for being here today. Welcome, Emily. Sorry, Emily, you are muted. Oh. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to get started right away.
Yeah, while she pulls up the screen share, you should know we'll be having a Q&A session at the end. So if you have questions, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask your questions, and we'll answer them later.
That's great. And so with no further ado, I'm going to get into the lecture itself. Hopefully the screen share is working completely. And here it is: Submit, Publish, Repeat: How to Publish Your Work in Literary Journals. So probably most of you gathered here today already know this, but just in case someone doesn't or needs a refresher, I'm going to start by talking about what actually is a literary journal. A literary journal is a magazine that is devoted to publishing written work and often visual art. Literary magazines usually publish short stories, poetry, and essays. Literary journals can be print, electronic, or both. Some literary journals publish a broad swath of work. Some just focus on literary fiction. Others will basically publish anything under the sun. Some only publish very specific kinds of work. This could mean they only publish poetry or science fiction or work by older women. There's a great poetry journal called Quartet that only publishes poetry by women 50 and up, for example. So they can be really niche or very broad. And they're all considered sort of literary journals. And some of them overlap more with magazines like The New Yorker, but most of them publish primarily literary work. In the decade I've spent teaching and writing about submitting, as well as actively submitting myself to literary journals, I've discovered that in order to motivate most writers to submit, you have to actually start with why they should be submitting. Why writers should submit to literary journals. Reason number 1, it is very hard to publish a traditional manuscript without having a history of past publication. I teach the manuscript publishing course at Writers Publish, and as part of that, authors put together a query letter to connect with agents and publishers about their book. And in the query letter, there's a section for a bio where they can talk about themselves. And a lot of writers don't have anything to put in that section that isn't personal because they don't have a publication history. And this is where literary journals come in, is that they're one of the best and most realistic ways to create a track record of publication. Because when you submit to a literary journal, they don't really expect you to have a track record. But when you submit to a publisher, they do expect you to have this track record of publication. This is particularly true when it comes to poetry manuscripts and short story collections. And what I mean by that is that most short story and manuscript publishers expect some of the work from your manuscript, up to almost 50%, to have been previously published in literary journals. And if you go in and have no publication history at all, most of the time your manuscript will be completely ignored. And some poetry and short story manuscript publishers are upfront about this, but many don't include it in the guidelines, even though they very much still consider it when picking who they're going to publish. This is one of the reasons I feel so strongly about literary journals being accessible to all and information on how to submit to be accessible to everyone, because this is one of the filtration systems that can create gatekeeping against historically underrepresented populations and against older populations, against all sorts of groups of people that are outside of academia. And thankfully, over the last 10 years, literary journals have become a lot more accessible outside of academia, but for a long time, they were sort of relegated to that. And that created, this very small pool of writers to pull from. Even if the work you are publishing in literary journals differs vastly from your manuscript, agents will still consider these publications to be a good sign. For example, all the work you've published in literary journals can be poetry, but that will still help support the publication of your novel. They don't consider this a mark against you. Reason number 2, publishing in literary journals can create a sense of legitimacy and lead to other opportunities, including, but not limited to, improving one's hireability. I experienced this one firsthand. Actually, when I got my MFA, during that program, I taught senior citizens and high school seniors, and that was a wonderful experience. But when I got out of that program, I was only really eligible to teach college students, yet I had no experience teaching college students. So I applied to a lot of jobs teaching college, and I got a lot of rejections. But during this time, I kept submitting to literary journals, and I built up this good past publication list on my CV. And I ended up being hired as a college professor because of my past publications. And the person who hired me actually explicitly said that, and also that I would be getting $2 more an hour because of that. It was terrible pay overall, but it still helped. Also, it's really important to publish in literary journals because it encourages others to ask you to participate in readings and other literary events. It increases one's literary profile overall. Sometimes literary journals have their own reading series, for example, but often editors will be involved in other sorts of literary life. And so they might ask you to help them out at a different reading series, for example. And it also leads sometimes to editors soliciting submissions from you, so you don't even have to submit, which is always nice. Reason number 3. This overlaps with reason number 2, but is significant enough to deserve its own slide. Submitting to literary journals helps make you part of the larger literary community. Sometimes this community can seem passive and tangential, but other times you can get involved with the journal beyond contributing your work. Sometimes that is as a reader or as an editor. There's all sorts of ways that you can help even with their promotions. And it's interesting because the literary agent, Michael Mangello, he gave a presentation for us last year, and he talked about how literary journals really are a mark in favor of an author, and that it's really important to get involved in the literary community through that way, because you are contributing your work to these literary journals, even if you're not doing anything beyond that. Reason number 4. Literary agents and publishers actively read prestigious and respected literary journals. They can also read more unusual literary journals, up-and-coming literary journals, but like the big ones, like the Paris Review and the New Yorker, those will definitely be read by literary journals and publishers, but they're also, more adventurous sometimes. So smaller publications can help as long as they're not really approachable, which means they accept 50% or more. Many authors are found by literary agents and or publishers because the agent publisher read the author's work in a literary journal and solicited a submission from them. This actually happened very recently to a subscriber of ours, and it's also happened to friends of mine. And it's happened to very famous authors like Elizabeth Gilbert of Eat, Pray, Love fame. That's how she started out. Reason number 5. Readers can connect with your work and become fans before you've published a collection if you are actively publishing your work in literary journals. They can help motivate you as a writer and help support your collection when it is published. I have gotten emails from strangers around the world, and presentations on my work have been given in college classrooms in very interesting locations because they've been published online, and then these readers reach out to me and we create a genuine relationship, and that is so important. They would never see my work if I wasn't actively publishing in these venues, and I would have never met them. A well-known journal or one that's very active on social media can really expand your reader base. If these readers start following you on social media, this can become data worth sharing with agents while querying. I've heard a lot of agents talk about their ideal client having about 5,000 Twitter followers, and I'm not saying publishing in literary journals will give you that, but it's a step in the right direction and it can help. Reason number 6. When your work is published in a collection, you can reach out to the journals that previously published your work. This often leads to the journal promoting your work in one or all of the following ways: promoting your book on social media, reviewing your book, publishing an interview with you, and sharing links to your book with their email list. And so in my experience promoting a chapbook, I reached out to all 9 of the publishers who'd published individual poems in that chapbook, and 8 of them ended up promoting me in one or all of these ways, and that really helped me sell the chapbook. Often writers tell me that they want to submit to literary journals because they want to get paid. This is an understandable motivation, but not a realistic one. Most journals don't pay, and the ones that do pay largely pay token amounts. This is because most journals are a labor of love. The editors, the readers, and everyone involved don't make money off the content and often contribute their own money as well as their own labor to making it possible. And so earlier when I talked about just giving your work to literary journals being part of the community is because you are giving it. You are not usually being paid for it. Although there are some journals that pay token amounts, but it doesn't really add up over time. For example, when I was first starting out, I had 5 pieces forthcoming in various literary journals, and I was very excited. And I told my brother-in-law about it. And he goes, "That's great. How much are they paying you?" And the answer was nothing. And I told this to him, and he's from the corporate world. He's really great, but he has a completely different work life than I do. And so he was like, "That's terrible. They're stealing from you." And I said, "No, I want to give it to them." But it got me thinking, what if I only submitted to journals that paid? So for the next 4 to 6 months, I only submitted to literary journals that were paying, and I got another 4 to 6 acceptances. And from that, I made, I think, $250. I told him about this. He was not particularly impressed at all, but one of our friends at the time was an editor at Poets and Writers. And I told her about it anecdotally. And she's like, "That's so wonderful. That's incredible. We should publish an article about this in Poets and Writers. Write it up for us." I never got around to doing that. And I probably should have. But that shows that from like an editor's perspective, someone who's actually in this world, how rare it is to get paid decent amounts and make decent money off creative work. There are exceptions. A lot of science fiction publications pay very well, but for more literary work, only the really rich publications pay properly. How to submit your work to literary journals. So hopefully I've motivated you from that part to really listen to this part, because this is the practical part of where the rubber meets the road. Step 1, how to prepare your creative work. I could give a week-long lecture on this, but the basics are: proofread your work, get creative feedback on your work, revise your work, and repeat as needed. The more polished your work is and the tighter it is, the better chance it will have of being accepted. A lot of people have this idea that editors are going to copy or content edit your work, and ideally they will. And some journals are very good at this and they go over multiple drafts, but a lot of them are expecting completely polished work when they receive it. And that's more or less the default setting. So go in with that assumption and be pleasantly surprised when something else happens. Step 2, prepare your cover letter. A lot of writers overthink the cover letter. It should be formal, short, and to the point. For example, dear editors, the following poems are for your consideration. Thank you for your time. Warmly, Emily Harstone. That is very close to my actual cover letter. It is very basic. And the thing is, lots of editors receive thousands of submissions a month, if not just hundreds. And this is overwhelming. They don't have enough time to really pay attention to the cover letter. It's not where their interest lies. So short and sweet is definitely the way to go. Sometimes submission guidelines ask you to include word count or personal information in your cover letter that goes beyond what I said before. Always follow the submission guidelines. I gave you the default template. Make sure you follow what they actually say on the website. Step 3, prepare your bio. Most journals ask for a 50-word third-person bio with links. When you first start submitting, there might not be much you can put in the bio. The more your work is published, the easier it is to find content for your bio. And it is true that the first few months of actively submitting to literary journals are usually the slowest months. I think the first 5 to 6 months I was actively submitting, I received maybe 1 acceptance, but mostly just rejections. And it really sort of helped when I started to have past journals to list in the bio. That was a turning point for me. I always have more than 1 bio ready to go because now I have a lot of content to draw from and a lot of experience to draw from. I get to pick and choose what to include and how that matches up with the literary journal. Like if it's an academic literary journal, I'll mention that I have an MFA. If it's a more experimental literary journal, I might mention some writing challenges that I've done. I try and go off the tone of the bios they publish and match it with one of the bios I have already created. Step 4, create a submission tracker. A submission tracker is a document or spreadsheet where you keep track of the pieces you've submitted and which markets you've submitted them to. I know someone who has a physical grade book and keeps it all in that. I think it is much easier to put it online or on your computer because then you can search it much more easily with the find button. This submission tracker should list the names of the journals, the name of the place you submitted, the name of the piece you submitted rather, and the date you submitted it. It should be organized into 3 sections: pending submissions, rejections, and acceptances. And one of the reasons it's really important to track rejections is you don't just submit to a literary journal once. If they reject your work, you wait however long. Sometimes they have a given period of time, like 2 to 6 months. Sometimes they don't, and you can submit again right away. But I still usually wait a month or 2. And then you submit new work, but you don't want to submit the same old work. So tracking it is very important in terms of that. Many new submitters convince themselves that they don't need a submission tracker right away. This can lead to lots of problems. Simultaneous submissions, submitting to more than 1 journal at a time, is highly encouraged now. But when your poem or prose is accepted somewhere, you have to withdraw it from everywhere else. And please don't ignore this. You really do have to do that. This is an impossible task without a submission tracker because you don't know where else it is. One of the secrets to getting published is submitting a lot. Submission trackers help encourage that. Step 5, start researching journals. This is one of the big questions a lot of people send to Authors Publish is, where do I find journals to submit to? There are lots of resources online, but some of them can be really overwhelming. we review one literary journal a week, and we also regularly release lists of literary journals. And these lists tend to be organized around different themes or ideas, like 7 most exciting new literary journals, like journals that have only been here 6 months or less, or just a big list of print journals, or a list of only science fiction journals. And we keep, or journals that have fast response times. And we regularly publish one of these lists at least once a month, and usually more than that. And it's always sent out on Mondays. But we are far from the only resource. And a lot of these resources have come in the last 5 years or so. These used to be much more limited, and it's really been great that there's all these additional resources now. We also recommend the following. And so below on this list, when you have the slideshow in a couple of days, when Jacob sends it out, all of these are going to be links to the actual databases, but obviously you can't click on it now, but I'm going to talk you through them. The first one is the Poets and Writers database. This is the most well-known, and it's not that extensive. Duotrope, which I'm going to talk about next, is much more extensive, but the real problem I have with Poets and Writers is they don't mention if a journal charges a fee or not, and they're also not terribly up to date. And so for those 2 reasons, they wouldn't be my first choice to go to for extra. Duotrope is a really good resource, and it was what I used starting out. It used to be a nonprofit. And one of the things that is really great about it is that it asks users to say if they've been accepted or rejected by a journal and how quick the response time was, and helpful data like that. And so you can see if a journal has an acceptance rate of, say, 50% versus an acceptance rate of 0.2%. And that is really helpful. Unfortunately, it does cost $50 a year. And as they've started to charge users, the information has become more limited. It used to have data on a huge range of journals, and now I think it only has data on maybe a couple hundred, which is a real limitation. I still think it's helpful and useful, but it's more limited than it used to be. It's definitely not a requirement to subscribe. Submittable Discover is another resource. Submittable is the big submission manager now, and Discover is where they list all the journals that work with them. And so it's limited to all the journals that work with them. And many of those journals charge, but it still does have some helpful non-charging journals, and is always upfront if they charge a fee. The submission grinder is really great in a lot of ways. It was started because Duotrope started charging a fee, and it operates on the same basic principle as Duotrope, is that users input how acceptance rates and that kind of data, but not enough people have ever used it for it to be that helpful outside of a few big journals. So do keep that in mind. But maybe if everyone at this lecture joins up and starts submitting their information in the submission grinder, it will be really helpful. So that'd be great. Lit Mag News Roundup is really new, but it's founded by the person who for a long time ran the review, which was a great resource also. It's a Substack newsletter, and they do great events like submission halls and things like that. But there is a fee attached if you want more than their free newsletter. I'm currently just a free subscriber, but it can really be worthwhile. And the last resource is far from the least. It's really new. It's only been around a couple of months, but I find it very exciting. It's called Chill Subs, and I really think it's a well-organized website. But what puts it over the top for me is that it includes information like how active the journal is on social media, which is really helpful. And it also is really searchable. You can only see journals that are currently open to submissions. And so far, it's really up to date. And it's searchable by all sorts of metrics. I really highly recommend you checking them out. They only have a couple hundred journals listed there now, but they keep increasing. And there are so many journals out there. There's thousands of journals. And you can see more of the full list on Duotrope because really almost everyone is listed with them. Step 6, evaluating a literary journal. So you can do this step at any time. but it is one of the most important steps. How you evaluate a journal is deeply personal, and it has a lot to do with what your goals as a writer are and also where you are in your life. And mine's definitely changed over time, but I'm going to walk you through how I evaluate a journal right now. So this is Duotrope. I still often start out on Duotrope because I've been using it for so long, and because I really like seeing acceptance levels, even if they aren't completely accurate, and get a loose idea of what the journal is seeking, although this data isn't always up to date. So this is for Rust and Moth, which is a journal I actually have been published in and is a great journal. But you see the little write-up at the top. And then if you could scan down on this page, which you can't, you would see their acceptance rates and their response times. And so for me, it's really important that a journal doesn't take over 6 months to respond. There's some journals that take years. I'm not going to name names. Some of them are associated with very famous universities. But I did receive a rejection once 5 years later after an acceptance. So it is important to have reasonable turnaround times in my opinion, and that is something I look for. So I look at this page and then I visit the website. Even if it's a print journal, the website matters. The website is most people's first impression of the journal. It should be quick to load, easy to navigate, and in my opinion, aesthetically pleasing. There are some journals that still have like a bright purple background with tiny white font, and it's impossible to read without hurting your eyes. And I don't want my work presented that way because I care about people's eyes. But that's a personal choice too. Maybe that really appeals to you. I really think you should be able to find creative work easily once you log into once you are on the website. And I always read a piece or two before submitting if it's available online. This can be up to 5 pieces. It really depends. I'm a poet, so I'm submitting poetry. Usually a poem or 3 will be enough to give me a good feeling. Maybe 1 story is enough because that's more of a time commitment if you're a prose writer. But this gives me a better idea of what they publish and if my work is a good fit, and also like within the scope of my work, which pieces might be a good fit for this journal. And that is really helpful. This is the kind of website I like to see. It's straightforward and easy to navigate with a satisfying visual image. If I was to click on the names of those poems, I would see those poems. It would be really easy to use. It's very intuitive, no sorts of confusion. And that's really helpful. Then I read the submission guidelines carefully. Usually in the submission guidelines, they tell you what kind of work they're looking for. And sometimes they do this in a practical way, say like they want work focused on writing by plumbers, for example, something really specific like that. That's really helpful, actually. But most of the time, their guideline, they say they're looking for your best poems or something really generic and open to interpretation like that. And that is deeply frustrating and hard to navigate. For example, the poems that I personally think are my best are the ones I've always struggled to publish the most. The poems that I think of as okay, but a little one note are the ones that seem to be the easiest to get published. And so submitting my best work isn't actually what they want me to do because that is such a subjective term. So I do think that it's better to decide what work to submit based on the actual work they've published in the past, rather than their submission guidelines, unless they want work along a theme. Like sometimes they're only publishing poems about spring, for example. So when I'm at the submission guidelines, I verify that they are open to submissions. I verify that they consider the length and genre of my work, and I comply with every single aspect of the submission guidelines. They are guidelines, not suggestions. Many are broad and easy to follow. Some take more time. And so if you ever Google articles by editors about how to submit, you will notice that almost all of them stress following the submission guidelines. This is not because most people follow the submission guidelines. Most people don't follow the submission guidelines. I read through all of the submissions we get at Authors Publish, and I will say that we only publish writing about writing and publishing. So we don't publish any creative work, and we don't publish anything to do with freelance writing. And all of that information is there in our submission guidelines. But about 75% of the content we receive has nothing to do with writing or publishing. We regularly receive articles about politics and hair care and vegan diets, and I can't publish them. And so this is why the editors really stress that, is it's very important, because you're putting effort in, but you're not actually going to connect with anyone if you're submitting something they can't publish, because they do not have the platform for it. As you spend time evaluating journals, start to decide what your priorities are in terms of publishing. And this is really deeply personal also. Like, for a while, I was only submitting to UK journals because I had a much higher acceptance rate there. And then I went through the period of only submitting to journals that paid. And over the years, there's been a lot of variety in what I'm focused on. Maybe you're only interested in print journals, or you only want to make connections with local journals. I would always encourage to submit to local journals, because they're more likely to have a local literary community you can be a part of. Still spend time seeing what else is out there, but start to create a list of journals you want to submit to. And always put notes next to their name, because otherwise you might not remember why you put them down. Your goals and priorities will probably change over time. That's actually a good thing. You can see which markets you're having the most success with. You can decide that you're really only interested in science fiction. Like, things change over time, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. Personally, I don't submit to a journal if they're looking for work that is very different from mine. I just don't see the point. I am not an experimental writer. If they publish experimental work, I am probably not the best fit for them. I also don't submit if I don't like their website. I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into more details about it. I'm also not going to submit if they have a limited demographic that I am not a part of. And what I mean by this is that, well, some journals only publish work by women over 50, or by BIPOC writers, or by LGBTQ plus writers. There's all these limited demographics out there. There's journals that only publish work by men over 40. So there's all these sort of niche markets that I am not a part of. There are some that I am a part of, and I would submit to those. I submit to journals that include work by disabled writers. So make sure that you match the demographic. If they accept most of what is submitted to them, I don't submit to them. And sometimes that's not available, but if the data is on Duotrope, if it says they accept 50% or more, I am not interested in them. I tend to submit to journals that have between a 0 and 5% acceptance rate, which is pretty challenging. And I also don't submit if they charge a submission fee. I'm going to go into more detail on that one on the slide. So this is why I have a problem with submission fees. I could do a whole lecture on this, but I'm not going to. This is only going to be one slide. So submission fees are generally $3 to $5, which don't sound like much, but these add up over time and prevent a lot of people, particularly members of historically underrepresented communities, from submitting their work. If I am not interested in literary journals being a gatekeeper in that way, and I don't think it's very helpful at all, I think is particularly problematic because the most prestigious journals, the ones that tend to nominate poems that actually win the pushcart, for example, are even more likely to charge, even though they have a less than 1% acceptance rate and largely solicit their submissions. So most of what they're actually publishing is through solicited submissions, but they are still charging writers to be considered and to get nothing in return. This doesn't mean I don't think you shouldn't support literary journals in other ways. I really strongly believe in supporting literary journals. We subscribe to over a dozen of them. I regularly put money in tip jars on websites. I promote literary journals as much as I possibly can. We have an authors published literary journal fund that gives out $150 to journals that don't charge submission fees. So I really believe in literary journals. I do not believe in charging those fees. And I go into much more detail and talk about the nuance of that at an article you can read at the link once this is posted in the slides, once the slides are posted. Step 7, submitting to literary journals. Once you get in the habit of it, submitting to literary journals can take less than 10 minutes, particularly if you follow the previous steps and have work ready to go. But that doesn't mean you can skip reading the submission guidelines. I know I'm stressing this again, but always read and follow the submission guidelines. Actually submitting usually involves picking which piece is the best fit for that particular literary journal, sending an email or using a submission manager. Submittable is by far the most common one, but there are others. All that you need to submit generally is a cover query letter, a brief third-person bio, your creative work, all things I covered earlier. And it's really important that after you submit your work, you update that submission tracker and you get in the habit of doing that every single time. Step 8, repeat. What trips most submitters up is that they only submit to 1 to 5 journals per year. In order to be actively publishing in literary journals, you should be submitting to at least 50 places a year. I know this sounds overwhelming. Usually when I tell this to a live audience, people are pretty turned off by this, but it is really important. And so I'm stressing this and I'm being honest with you about it. That doesn't mean you need to have 50 pieces ready to go. Simultaneous submissions are the secret to most writers' success. So if you're submitting to journals that only have a 1% acceptance rate, for example, you can submit the same short story to 10 journals at the same time, and maybe all of them will pass on it. But that's why simultaneous submissions are helpful. A lot of authors challenge themselves to get 100 rejections a year. It's a good goal. When I was submitting the most, I was receiving 150 rejections a year and 20 plus acceptances. And at all times, I had 40 submissions out or more. And that's what a lot of famous authors do, is they have 40 submissions. When they were starting out, is they had 40 submissions out. Several of my grad school professors told me that number specifically, actually. So this is the in conclusion. The most common question I get is, what if all I'm receiving are rejections? So this matters a little. Like if you've only submitted to 3 places, of course, all you've received is rejections. So make sure you're submitting to a lot of places. But starting off is always hard. Once you have a good track record of publication, it generally helps. Like those first 4 months were my hardest for submitting. It also helps to continually write new work and revise old work. This is how you get better, is you keep tightening your old work and you continue to write new work. This lecture is a good starting point, but I have so much to say beyond this. I also have a free ebook on the subject, Submit, Publish, Repeat, that Jacob will send you in a few days, the brand new edition. It's on the 7th edition. It's been taught in college classrooms all over, and it has great reviews on Goodreads, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback about it over the years. And it goes into the details of what I've covered here today, but I also teach an entire course about this. So I've taken a lot of content and tried to compress it as much as possible. And the good thing is, if I haven't covered it, hopefully we'll be able to answer it in the questions. So thank you and good luck. And I look forward to listening to your questions.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. You provided so much clarity, and you gave everyone what I feel is a very straightforward process if they want to follow this path of publishing in literary journals. We have a lot of questions. I do not think we'll be able to answer all of them, but we're going to try to get to as many as we can. So if you do have a question, you can press the Q&A button. You can also, there should be a button for you if you're watching this live, to a little thumbs up if there's a question you want answered. So let's get to it. The first question comes from Julie, who's been published in the Alaska Quarterly Review, Chicago Quarterly Review, and others of that caliber. They're asking, is it a mistake to publish some work in less prestigious journals, or is a publication better than not publishing anything at all?
I think that's a really good and complex question. And it's hard to give a one size fits all answer to that. But I think it is really worth submitting to a diversity of publications, in part because a lot of the journals I submitted to a long time ago were fledgling journals that had been around less than 6 months. And many of those journals went under completely, which was very unfortunate. And some of them went on to be very famous and prestigious journals now. And so that was really helpful to me, even though at the time I was very much taking a risk on them. And so I think it's really worth taking a risk on things, especially if they don't, if they're not well known for publishing everything, if they're not on our approachable list, if they're not listed on Duotrope as accepting 30% or up, if they're more of an unknown quantity, that can really help you because they can become more prestigious later on. But also sometimes editors with big name journals, and this happened to a friend of mine, she published with a small journal that was not well known at all. And the editor really liked their work. And they said, actually, I'm an associate editor now at Cooper Nickel, which is really well regarded. And I would like to solicit more submissions from you. And so they actually got a really good publication from this mediocre publication. And actually one of my most beloved poems that has gone on to be taught in a lot of classrooms was published in this not very well-known journal at all. And so I really don't think I think it's hard to predict in advance how these things move. And I think it's, as long as it's not a journal that publishes basically everything and is poorly presented, I think you should submit, especially if you like the way the work they're publishing and you like the way they present it.
Thank you. Do you think it's a question of just if you would feel good about seeing your work? And is that the primary question, or really if you would feel good about seeing your work in a journal, then that's the most important filter?
I mean, for me, that's the most important filter. When I am about to press submit, I always ask myself, would I be excited if I was published here? And if the answer is no, then I might not submit anymore.
That makes sense. So Patricia has a question. Can you submit excerpts from a self-published book after it's been published?
So most literary journals do not do reprints of work that has been self-published, even if it's online, unless it's in a private blog. And some make exceptions for social media. So I think you could not submit that, unfortunately. There are some places that are open to reprints, but it's pretty limited.
And isn't it also pretty limited to do excerpts of longer work?
So if your excerpt can stand on its own, there are a lot more journals open to it. But if your excerpt can't, there's less than 10 journals that are open to that sort of work.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Holly has a question. Does experience being published in other realms, i.e. academic or religious, help towards literary publishing?
I think so. In my experience, literary journals are looking for life experience too. So for example, if someone is an attorney, that might be more appealing to them, especially if they've published, if most of what they publish is just by poets. Most submitters are just writers. And so those people that are outside that realm definitely appeal to them. I think it depends on what sort of religious publication. The caliber of the publication still does matter, but I would include it, especially initially.
Do you think that plays into the types of subject matter that typically gets submitted to journals, where people with other experiences may be more likely to be submitting things that aren't what is typically submitted to journals?
Definitely. And I think journals often get a lot of work about writing. And so they're excited to see work sort of outside of that realm. There are exceptions, of course, but I've noticed that a lot of people, like I've helped submit for an attorney before and also for a doctor. And both those people had really good luck right from the beginning with finding homes for their work, I think, because they came from this different perspective.
Okay. Another question is, this is a simple question, but maybe a good question. Is it possible to be submitting too much?
So the one way I've gotten myself in trouble before by submitting too much is by submitting work to the same work. Say I have packet A and packet B, and I am submitting packet A and B to journals of the whole range, like journals that accept 1% of what's submitted to them and journals that accept 30% of what's submitted to them. Then the more approachable journal is much more likely to have a faster response time and accept my work before the more prestigious one can even read it. And so what I recommend, just for in terms of getting around that, is you have packet A and you only submit it to the hardest journals, and you have packet B and you submit it to slightly less hard journals, and then you have a packet C, which is submitted to even less hard journals. And that way, because everyone's in sort of the same range in the same packet, you won't have a really easy to get in journal grab that work before a hard one can say yes. And slowly, like if all of this work isn't published by these prestigious journals, packet A can be slid down and become the new packet B, and there can be a new packet A, for example. But generally, I think you can submit a lot of work, and that is a good approach as long as you're being careful with it.
That makes sense. This is my own question, but do you ever just have a poem you really want to get out there, so you just look for places that are really easy, that have higher acceptance rates, and you just send it to them?
Yes, but within reason. I still wouldn't submit it to a journal that hasn't over a 50% acceptance rate. But there might be exceptions. Like there's some newer journals that have higher acceptance rates that still have a good presentation online that I still like reading their site. Like the Daily Drunk does a good job of that. And I might submit the right work to someone like that.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Someone was listening to a podcast with an agent reading a query letter, and the writer had included a publication in a literary journal in the bio section, but the agent said the publication in the journal clashed with the book they were querying because the genre was horror, but the publication presumably was not. So it seems that maybe that won't help if it doesn't match the genre. Do you have thoughts on that?
So I've talked to a lot of agents about this, and I publish mostly poetry, but I have this manuscript now that is not poetry at all, and it's speculative fiction. And every single agent I've talked to has seen this as a good thing that I've published all of this poetry. So I know, at least in terms of poetry versus speculative fiction, people seem to make an exceptions for that, but maybe with some genres, there's harder lines. I do know that two of the agents I've talked to have specifically said that they don't care if the genre is completely different from the book itself. And one of them was very well known. So I do think this is something, like, all agents have very different perspectives, and this is something I think agents have different perspectives on.
Mm-hmm. There are many different types of agents in the world, so yeah, it would seem that there would be a lot of different perspectives. But I also think that, like with horror and specifically, there are a lot of outlets specifically for publishing horror stories. So if that's your genre, you should be trying to publish stories in that genre, right?
Definitely.
Now, this is not quite related to literary journals, but what if you previously published nonfiction articles? Does that in a similar way help your manuscript get taken more seriously?
It depends where you've published them. Like if you've published them in the New York Times, for example, or really well-known websites, that can definitely help.
It's just another thing that gives you a little bit of credibility.
Definitely.
Okay. someone is asking, Ron is asking about the reality that the odds of getting published are phenomenally low or even lower. And hence, writers need to understand that tons of rejections are normal. So if they are to get published, they must continue and continue and continue. That's not quite a question, but can you relate that to literary journals and how that might lead to publication of a book with a traditional publisher?
Well, because it's not really a question and I'm having a hard time parsing it, how you presented it a little, I'm going to try and answer it, but I'm not sure if I'm going to answer it correctly. So how I feel about this is the great thing for me personally is I actually was a reader for a literary journal, and then I was an editor for a literary journal before I ever started submitting. And we took 1,000 poems and carved them down to 6 that we published. And I remember that process, just weeding out all of these poems. I remember it being really good in preparing me to be on the other end of the rejection process, because some poems I rejected because I was just in a grumpy mood, probably. I mean, I'm not sure, but I think that probably happened because I had to read so many over, I think, 3 months. It was such a compressed period of time. And so I really think that actively submitting, like if you submit as much as I've submitted, when you get rejections, even at the manuscript level, they don't hurt in the same way. And in fact, I see them almost as stepping stones. And now that I'm actively querying, I've gotten a lot of people saying, oh, this is really great. It's not quite the right fit for me, but I'll get rejections off of the full, and I'll almost always get some sort of personal follow-up. And I see that even as a stepping stone towards this more publication. Like I don't see, when I get those sort of messages, I don't see them as discouragement. I see them as encouragement. But someone who's just started out with rejections, they don't necessarily know that it's so rare to receive these.
I think that's something you go into detail in the book Submit, Publish, Repeat, about the idea of tiered rejections. Is that right?
Yes.
And they can be really helpful to authors to learn that maybe they're being encouraged as opposed to discouraged when they get a rejection.
Yeah, but tiered rejections are definitely different than personal rejections. Like personal rejections, someone's at least written a line personally for you. But tiered rejections are when a journal has, and I do talk about personal rejections in the book as well. Tiered rejections is when the journal has a standard response for how excited they are to see more work by you. And there's this great website that I talk about in the book called Rejection Wiki, where you can see sort of different journals' tiered rejections.
I would say in my own experience submitting, I haven't done a lot of submissions for literary journals, but in my own experience, when I submit to a brand new literary journal, the odds of me getting published go way up, but also the odds of just getting a personal response go way up. So that's, in my experience, one of the better ways of just getting published is look for the brand new literary journals. Yeah. So, and sort of a related question is how, and maybe you don't want to answer this, but how often do you say you do a round of like submissions to 10 literary journals and all of them end up getting rejected?
Well, right now I'm mostly submitting to literary journals that have an under 3% acceptance rate. So I would say almost all of them get rejected every single time. There's always exceptions.
Yeah, and you have an incredible track record of publication in quite a few renowned journals, and that still happens. So maybe that's encouraging to everyone out there.
I think one of the most heartening things for me to read was there's this very, very famous poet who has been published in who was nominated for the Pulitzer and has like 3 books out, and they'd still been rejected by this one journal for 10 years straight. And they finally got an acceptance and they were so excited about it. And it showed me like how hard it is and how they still couldn't get into that journal with a Pulitzer nom. So it's really tough out there sometimes.
We have a number of questions about social media. Do you think it's important or matters whether you're on social media when submitting to literary journals?
I mean, lots of journals now want to promote your Twitter or your website. But I've never gotten that many more Twitter followers from doing that. And Twitter is not a platform I particularly enjoy, so maybe that's part of it. I don't think it's a requirement. I do think you should have some sort of web presence, like pick one place to be present online. It could be your personal website, it could be Twitter, it could be Facebook, some sort of public persona where people can reach you. But what I do is on my website, I list my email address, and that's how most of the readers have gotten in touch with me, actually.
We're just about out of time, but is there any, when someone's getting started, what's the most important thing they should focus on or put their attention to?
Well, I mean, the work itself is really important, and revising it and making sure it's clean. But I think it would just be to persist. Like I see so many people that put in all this work, submit to 1 or 3 journals that have a very tiny acceptance rate, and then are like, they're done for the year or the rest of their life. And you have to persist. Persistence is so important and is the key to publication, both in terms of literary journals and in terms of manuscript publishing.
That's great. I think that's very helpful for those who choose to follow that advice. I think what you said in the presentation about having 40 submissions out at a time reflects that idea. I want to thank everybody for being here today. We're going to continue the lecture series next month and onward. If you have any questions for me, you can email support@authorspublish.com. And also you can reach Emily there as well. If you have questions for Emily, she works for Authors Publish. You can reach her at support@authorspublish.com as well. I want to thank everybody for being here and for your support for the lecture series. And I also want to thank everybody behind the scenes. There's a lot of people who make Authors Publish and this lecture series possible. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.